Hi, and welcome to part 4 of our exercise kinesiology and lecture series. Today we're going to be going over the core as well as rate of perceived exertion, RPE, or reps in reserve, otherwise known as RIR. As a recap, in video series number 1, we talked about the push muscles of the upper body. In video series 2, we talked about the upper body pull muscles. And in video series 3, we talked about the lower body, legs, glutes, and feet. If you would like to watch any of those videos, please check them in the description, as well as revisit those whenever you want to. Today we're going to be discussing the core. Let's go ahead and get into it. In our video today, we're going to be looking at the anterior view of the abdominals, or the frontal view of the abs, as well as we're going to be looking at the back, or the lumbar. So let me go ahead and draw up a quick model of the entire back first, and we'll go into the lower body. Now, in video series 2, we discussed that the upper body pull muscles here are all in video 2. So if you have any questions about the upper body pull muscles, please review that one. Looking at the lower lumbar spine of our core, this is all wrapped in together. These we have what's called the erector spinae. The erector spinae allows spinal flexion from the posterior end of our spine. Think about postural, stand up straight. We don't want to slouch or round. This is a very typical and can be problematic in a lot of sit-down jobs where we typically sit a lot like this, or we drive like this, we're on our phones, we're cooking, we're taking care of our kids. We want to make sure that we have proper spinal flexion using the erector muscles, the spinal erectors. Within the spinal erectors, we also have the multifidi. The multifidi are stabilizing muscles in the lower spine. Because the spinal erectors are not fast twitch muscle fibers, or they're not very explosive, they are inefficient at reacting to stimulus, in the sense of if I slip or fall, or if I accidentally hit a rear view mirror in a parking lot and my back twists. The erector spinae cannot respond fast enough in those situations. So we also have the multifidi that are fast reacting muscle fibers that allow us to stabilize the spine in a quick moment of jerking or jolting. So those are our two lower body posterior core muscles. Secondarily, we have the anterior core muscles. Here we have the obliques on the side, as well as what we would consider the six-pack, or the rectus abdominis. The rectus abdominis is responsible for spinal flexion forward, rounding the spine in our prior example, as well as the obliques are responsible for flexion laterally, left and right. So when we combine the erector spinae, the obliques, and the rectus abdominis, we get a full rotation of the spine. That's their primary job. So when we're doing abdominal work, that's what we want to focus on, is moving the lower spine. We are not trying to engage down here in our hip flexors to try and get this movement to activate where we're falling forward like this. Think of a decline sit-up. Very often we think of a decline sit-up where our feet are tied in and our head is lower than our knees. Oftentimes we use the hip flexor to pull ourselves up, as opposed to bending the spine using the abdominals to round our way up instead of lifting from the hip flexor. So with those four muscles being discussed, those are our external mobile muscles. If we were to pull back the abdominals, the rectus abdominis, we would see what's called the transverse abdominis. The transverse abdominis works very much like a corset that ties your hips and your ribs together. It also allows for diaphragm breath support, as well as stability for the spine and integrity for the intestines. The transverse abdominis is what we would consider the powerhouse of our core. I remember back when I was a kid watching exercise videos growing up that my parents would do. They always talked about bracing your core. And I never really understood what they meant because I couldn't understand how can you hold a crunch using your rectus abdominis and do all of this work that they're talking about. Later, I learned, of course, being a trainer, that they weren't talking about the rectus abdominis at all. They were talking about the transverse abdominis, but they were using core as a catch-all statement. So when we think about bracing our core, when we're doing planks, when we are doing squats, deadlifts, bench press, standing overhead press, bent over dumbbell row, all of that has a core bracing mechanic, and that it all comes from the transverse abdominis. Now, how do you speak to your transverse abdominis? How do you get it to activate as opposed to trying to get your abs to contract? The transverse abdominis works automatically, and a lot of times we don't even think about us using it, but there are different cues that you can utilize to help get a conscious reaction from those muscles. Think about a busy house, or everyone's over for dinner, or you're at a crowded restaurant and you're trying to squeeze through a couple of chairs. You would naturally suck in and try and squeeze through those chairs. That is not the rectus abdominis, but more the transverse abdominis, pulling in and up to give you that space. That is a wonderful exercise that'll allow you to better connect mentally with the transverse abdominis, therefore translating that into proper bracing when you are squatting, deadlifting, bench pressing, or doing any other exercise. So vacuums, or that same model of breathing in, sucking the stomach in as hard as you can, and lifting the chest, is a great way of holding onto the transverse abdominis muscles and allowing them to contract consciously instead of letting them relax and be soft. A couple of benefits of training the transverse abdominis properly is, once again, stability for the spine, lower intestines, and a better, greater connection between your upper and lower body. But it also can shrink our waistline a fraction. We can get about maybe 1 inch smaller waistline, depending on who you are, by having tighter, more strengthened transverse abdominis muscles. So in trying to shrink our waistline, this is not only beneficial for mechanical purposes, but for aesthetic purposes as well. Wonderful. Now that we've touched on the core muscles, we're going to be discussing RPE. RPE is a scale that we can use to try and assess how much effort we are applying to any one set during a weightlifting or resistance exercise. This is a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being extremely easy and 10 being maximally difficult or failure as our scale. So to best talk about an RPE scale, we use what's called reps in reserve, or reps to failure. This is a great way of understanding if we're pushing hard enough during any given set or pushing too hard. To best demonstrate the RPE, we're going to be going from 10 down to 1 so you can better understand how this graph or how this scale can be applied to the gym, so we know if we're using the proper amount of weight or if we can go heavier or lighter. So as we started saying, 10 on the scale is failure. This is the point of measurement. This is not necessarily what we're trying to get to with every set, but it's the only value that is consistent depending on any set that you do. What that means is if 10 is failure, you cannot do any more reps, or you weren't able to complete the reps provided to you by your program or your trainer. 9 would be the next one up. And this means we are 1 rep till failure, or 1 RIR reps in reserve is another way of saying this. 8 would then be a 2 reps till failure, or a 2 RIR. Oops. As we progress up the model, we'll see that same pattern come to life. 3 is, or a 7 on the scale would be 3 reps till failure, or a 3 RIR. 6 means that there's 4 reps till failure, or 4 RIR. So on and so forth, 5 through 1. There's a specific reason why I mapped out these ones and went 5 to 1 as a blank 1, because you can carry this number all the way up to a 10 RIR, which means you have 10 or greater reps in reserve. With this metric, or with this scale, we're able to understand exactly how much effort we're applying to one given set. What we are looking for as the standard is somewhere around an 8 RPE or a 2 RIR. In most compound lifts where you're doing majority, where you're moving major muscle groups, such as the bench press, back squat, overhead press, deadlift, RDL, compound exercises are going to be taken to about an 8 RPE. Other exercises, such as bicep curls on the cable system, quad extensions, seated hamstring curls, abdominal work, these can be taken to more of a level 9 RPE or 1 RIR, because these are more controlled lifts and the risk to reward ratio is a little bit more isolated. So these would be isolation, where we're only using one muscle at a time, where we have a lot of focus. We don't want to explore too much into the 10 range. Only under a spotter, trainer, or friend that you trust with the weight can we venture into this 10 range, because this will give us an understanding of if we really are hitting the proper metrics. So if I'm using this scale and I'm doing bench press, and I believe that 135 pounds for 10 reps is my maximum 10 level RPE, I cannot get an 11th rep no matter how hard I try, then 8 reps would be my RPE 8. This doesn't have to necessarily be a 10 rep scale. We can utilize this same methodology in other numbers. Let's say we are doing 7 reps on a back squat. If I was to perform 7 reps at 225 on a back squat, and I know that I can get an 8th rep, but I'm really unsure about a 9th, then I'm more than likely in this 8 to 9 range. We are safe. We are creating enough muscle stimulus that the body can grow and adapt and get stronger, but we're not taking our risk to reward ratio too far. Conversely, if I have a spotter and I'm having him help me out with that same set of 225 for 7 reps, and we take it all the way to failure, or where my spotter has to assist me up from the last squat, and let's say I get 12 reps instead of the prescribed 7 reps, that means I had 5 reps left in the tank, or 5 reps in reserve. Following our scale, we know that that would put us at a 5 RPE, which means even though the weight may feel heavy, it's not heavy enough to create the proper amount of stimulus in order to grow the muscle. It's not saying that it's not an exercise or that it won't help, but we're not going to get as much stimulus as we could if we loaded that bar a little bit heavier and pushed ourselves a little bit more uncomfortably into that 8 RPE. So use this skill whenever you're doing any set at any time, and use this methodology of a 8 to 9, 8 for compound and 9 for isolation whenever you're doing your sets. And know that anything below here, anything from a 5 and up this direction, would be considered a warm-up. So now that you understand rate of perceived exertion, or reps in reserve, you can better identify the proper weight to use while doing your exercises. So thank you so much for going with me on this 4-part series of exercise science and kinesiology. I hope these videos serve you well. Come back to them anytime and check out my website for more information at gainsandgloryfitness.com. Thank you so much and stay healthy.